What I've tried to do in this chart here is give you a very quick overview of the history of disarmament in the chemical and the biological area. And if we go back until before, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, everything were unilateral declarations. In other words, it only applied to oneself, not to other people necessarily. After the Peace of Westphalia, we got the first international agreement, the Strasbourg Agreement, which was between France and Germany. But both of these elements entered into the First Hague Peace Conference, and there something interesting happened. The ban on poison and poisoned weapons was accepted without any dissent, and there was a second document, the Hague Declaration 4.2 on asphyxiating gases, and there was a lot of dissent. And what we got was basically a poisonous substance, but one was old, part of nature. Asphyxiating gases was part of scientific industrial developments that were taking place in the Second Industrial Revolution. And that explains then the later development. The ban on poison was reinforced at the Second Hague Peace Conference, and with the Nuremberg Principles of 1950, they were declared of universal application, irrespective of whether a state had signed up to the Hague Conventions or not. The declaration on asphyxiating gases led to the Geneva Protocol, which again split up in chemical biological weapons for the first time. And the Geneva Protocol was the direct precursor to the 1972 Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and the 93 Chemical Weapons Convention. After the terrorist attacks, both inspired Resolution 1540 of the Security Council to prohibiting the transfer of know-how, chemicals, biological materials to terrorists, non-state entities. However, the Geneva Protocol also was the foundation for the creation with the Iran-Iraq War in 1988 of the UN Secretary General's investigative mechanism, so that he has the authority to go inside the country to investigate allegations of use. And of course, it also laid the foundation for the International Criminal Court, where the language used in the Rome Declaration and later in the Kampala Review Conference document, the references to poisonous asphyxiating gases and to poison. So the Nuremberg Principles also influenced that. The thing to retain from the chart is most dimensions throughout history were parts of the laws of war. These are all the blocks in yellow. And then we got what we call disarmament law that emerged with the chemical and the biological weapons conventions. And the rest of my presentation is actually taking Syria as an example, a question of how do disarmament and laws of war interact with each other? Are they mutually reinforcing, or can they actually be contradictory in terms of purposes? Just to give you a quick reflection how the disarmament machinery, the two blue blocks essentially operated in Syria. So first and foremost, there was the use of chemical weapons starting in the first half of last year, and the UN Secretary General's mechanism was invoked at the request of the Syrian government. Having the OPCW as an international organization to implement the Chemical Weapons Convention, and WHO as one of the specialized agencies of the United Nations with a specific expertise, for the first time, the UN Secretary General was to draw on the resources of both organizations. They produced reports, no blame was apportioned, and there are open questions. In October of last year, Syria became a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So the UN Secretary General's investigative mechanism was no longer the primary tool, but key were the provisions inside the Chemical Weapons Convention and developed and trained by the OPCW. So the investigation for the chlorine attacks in April and May, and some also in August, were conducted exclusively by the OPCW with some support from the UN. There were 2 reports. Last Monday, there was an emergency session of the Executive Council, but again, no blame was issued on any party. And for the public, there are still many open questions. The other aspect of what happened in Syria was that a whole disarmament project was set up to eliminate chemical weapons in the country. You will recall last year in September there was the US-Russian framework agreement agreed in Geneva, and that is really interesting because for the first time in the history we had a hybrid between coercive disarmament, you know, the type of disarmament of the Versailles Treaty in 1919, the type of disarmament arrangement for Iraq after the liberation of Kuwait, and cooperative disarmament, which is Syria as a full state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that worked really well. All the chemicals were removed from the country. They have now been destroyed from the country. And slowly but surely, Syria is entering into what I would call the routine verification procedures under the terms of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But increasingly, with the way the law is, the situation on the ground is developing, international law is starting to have a problem. This morning we already discussed a bit about the role of sovereign state, but now there are whole parts of the country not under government control, and there is fighting going on between different non-governmental groups. In other words, there are now allegations of use of chemical weapons which have nothing to do with the Syrian government and which involve non-governmental entities over which the government has no control inside territory that is not under sovereign control by any state. And this is one of the big challenges we are going to face in the near future. Now, a key question, I mean, this conference is mostly about humanitarian law. I present a perspective from disarmament law, and everybody knows, who remembers last year, there was a lot of discussion. Why all the effort into getting rid of the chemical weapons? I mean, there were only some 1,500, 2,000 people killed, whereas there were over 100,000, close to 200,000 people killed through conventional weapons. There was a sense of injustice. So a certain quick reflection on why disarmament could work. The first element that's very important to bear in mind, there is a concrete task at hand. It's not about abstract principles that you try to apply. You had to get to weapon elimination. And disarmament, to work, historically this can be proved empirically time and time again, you need entities that treat each other on equal footing. If you don't do that, none of the principles work. One element that actually does that is the concept of the sovereign state. Think of the contract presented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where a person, a soldier, becomes an agent of the state. And the conflict is no longer personalized to the individual. And that's also the reason why wounded people and certain categories of people could be excluded from war. That was like the foundation of humanitarian law. In disarmament, because of the context of the Chemical Weapons Convention, it was possible for the United States, Russia, Syria to sit together and speak on an equal level with each other, and therefore we got some of the core agreements. At the same time, the goals are not abstract. They are not relative to something else. They are absolute. It's weapon elimination. Syria cannot have a single chemical weapon. The tasks to be undertaken by the international community have a clear finality. The other element that places, and this is quite remarkable, if you look at the failure of all other forums, it actually promoted dialogue. You have to think that countries that don't like each other, United States, Russia, Syria. Insurgents that do not like each other and definitely do not like the government. Then you have all the proxies on the outside trying to influence the outcome of the war. At one stage or another, they were all engaged in negotiations to make this project happen. It was the only thing during the Syrian war where people were actually talking to each other on equal footing. And obviously, organizations, international organizations that had been created, United Nations, OPCW, and WHO, they had an enhanced status. They were established. They were recognized to be neutral in the whole conflict, and they could play the roles they had to play. The foundation was a formal international agreement that then was translated in the Security Council resolution and decisions by the OPCW, and that actually created the legal framework for all the types of interactions that I have just mentioned. When one looks back at that period, it was an extraordinary period, September, October of last year, that the fact that the people started talking to each other, that the channels of communication were created between all the parties involved, directly in the fighting or outside because of interest, they created a foundation that enabled the launch of the Geneva II negotiations. What's happened there has nothing to do with this, but it created a positive atmosphere to allow the Geneva II negotiations to take off. The interim agreement with Iran on the nuclear program became possible because countries started working together, and obviously behind the scenes Iran was part of the negotiations in Geneva. The Lyon-Geneva sessions were taking place for a zone free of non-conventional weapons in the Middle East, and quite importantly, for regional disarmament, Israel's perceptions on the CW threat changed quite fast. In contrast now, we have the humanitarian and justice discourses, and from those people I had great problems justifying what I was doing and arguing, because, you know, as I've already mentioned, relatively small number of victims directly the result from chemical weapons compared to the overall war. So there was like no justice in trying to achieve something because there was something worse that was happening. And for the victims, that was also something we have heard this morning already in the Agent Orange case. International community can come together for disarmament, but there is no instantaneous justice or delayed justice for individuals who are the victims. That creates a different field of tension. Another blame was that the UN and the OPCW remained neutral as regard who is responsible. This is unavoidable because you can have the best verification machinery, you can have the best investigative tools to look at what happened. In the end, the judgment of responsibility is a political matter. That has nothing to do with facts. This is not the organizations, it's not the disarmament treaties at fault, it's the state parties who refuse to take up responsibilities or are looking at different types of interests there. Another thing which I found quite surprising, and I still have a big thing with a human rights watcher on this one, is that, you know, whatever the UN and the OPCW did not contribute to conflict resolution. In other words, people were arguing for military intervention by the West, and the fact that this did not materialize because international law did what it was supposed to be doing was taken as an issue for disarmament law. I mean, the Human Rights Watch condemned, they produced a document to prove, you know, that the Syrian government was responsible, and the executive director then requested military intervention. You know, during the Vietnam War, that was burn the village to save it type of policy. I don't know how people square that one. I certainly can't. And few constituencies were brought into the stakeholdership. In other words, of all the people in Syria, nobody really came together The Arab countries were not active in any way in the disarmament of Syria to promote that particular goal. So the result was, in my mind, many opportunities were squandered. There was the simplistic good versus evil rhetoric we were hearing, if only for domestic audiences. I mean, there was the fragmentation of the Syrian opposition, religious terrorism emerged, and now, of course, we have ISIL, which means that even if you have an idea that you want to support, intervene for humanitarian considerations, who are you going to choose? And how are you going to make sure that only the right people get your weapon support, whatever? The Gaza war, of course, didn't help in that matter. And the calls for justice, you know, wanting to blame somebody as something of an absolute position, that prevented all types of any rapprochement, any opportunity for dialogue. In other words, everybody was stonewalling, and in the meanwhile, the dynamics of fighting were just continuing. And today, we can actually see with ISIL coming into place, even if now regionally and globally, people can come together to intervene militarily and with human rights, human assistance, and so forth, the outcome is going to be completely different from what it would have been, you know, a year, 2 years ago. And definitely, in my mind, there is not going to be any justice for the victims in that world. So now, to come to the end, some final thoughts, where to look. Well, definitely, I think we have to see, recognize that the mere fact the Chemical Weapons Convention, the OPCW, exists, that has influenced the whole course of the past year and so on with regard to the disarmament project. First of all, it prevented military intervention. I mean, nobody was intervening because chemical weapons were used. People were intervening because they wanted to intervene because they had some strategic interests in that intervention, in the removal of Assad. And chemical weapons were just going to be the excuse. And let's not get blinded by that one. Now, the Syria case has raised expectations of what the OPCW can do. The conflict in Libya is escalating. The Libyan government has asked the OPCW for a similar type of operation. And we might see, who knows, in the next year or so that Israel actually ratifies the CWC. I'm going to Israel in a month and a half to have extensive discussions on the CWC. And then, of course, the BTWC doesn't have all the tools of the Chemical Weapons Convention, so how would the world respond in the case of a biological attack? If I want to look at what happened in Syria from a humanitarian perspective, and I think of humanitarian consequences if I think of justice, then I would say chemical weapon disarmament fulfilled one of the core goals of disarmament. This is preventing the use of weapons in war, preventing destabilization of international relations. So here what it did, okay, perhaps for the 1,000, 1,500 casualties of chemical weapons, there may be no instant justice, but we do know that there were no further victims of chemical warfare because the weapons have been removed. I think that is justice in the right way. Yes, we had the chlorine attacks, but already the number of attacks were much lower in number, the number of casualties were much lower, and the OPCW reacted with investigations. These attacks, to the best of my knowledge, have now stopped. And then, if you want to have another yardstick for judgment, just think with ISIL now in Iraq and Syria. If some of those chemical weapon stockpiles had still been around and they captured that territory, with the way they are already able to apply advanced conventional weaponry, I mean, we might have seen totally different type of war going on. So I will end with a call, because I think right now what we need to do, instead of talking next to each other and, you know, speaking in terms of goals relative in relative values of what is more useful than the other one, I think that we need a deeper study of the opportunities and the implications of humanitarian human rights law on the one hand and disarmament approaches on the other, and the ways they can collaborate with each other to end conflicts. And I do feel, I mean, even if we speak of disarmament law today, its roots are in the laws of war today, better known as humanitarian law. So it should no longer be either or, but I think we should really start thinking, developing a number of intellectual strategies in function of and. And one aspect that is really interesting, I have mentioned the International Criminal Court, the Rome Treaty. How would one organize the cooperation of the OPCW with the ICC? The ICC, very clearly in the Rome Statute, in the Kampala Declaration, they refer to, they use the words of the Geneva Protocol, they use the words of the Hague Conventions of 1899-1907, but there is no reference to the Chemical Weapons Convention in these documents. So how can anything that is done by the OPCW feed in one of the global tools we have for international justice? And the last note, my last note is, in neither document, Rome Statute, Kampala document, is there a reference to biological weapons. Thank you.